Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome to a session on the role of modern technology corporations in warfare with a specific case study of Israel. There have been a number of articles and even some journal articles in independent media, scholarly articles as well as journal articles in independent media, not mainstream media, regarding the role of corporations in facilitating modern warfare, even if it means genocide, as in the case of Israel. Clearly, there is a Geneva Convention which regulates the role of companies and holds them accountable for their collusion, if you will, with government in promoting, facilitating war against civilians, ethnic cleansing, as well as genocide. Just for the record, the United States has not ratified the UN Genocide Convention. The United States has decided against the ratification of the United Nations Convention on Genocide on the grounds, the government argued, that it compromises its sovereignty. Now, clearly, this is an argument that any country in the world can make, because the nature of entering into a multilateral agreement, especially one which involves a United Nations sub-agency or a United Nations convention, by nature, this means it necessarily compromises the sovereignty, because it compels the members of the United Nations to operate within the confines of the convention. The United States, again, has opted out of the Convention on Genocide. Not only that, but the United States, in February of 2025, roughly a few weeks after President Donald Trump was inaugurated, decided that it would impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court and on a specific member, namely the prosecutor of the court. Merely, the United States argued officially in it, and this is in its own website, merely because the ICC is not seen as friendly toward Israel and the United States. Again, by nature, these agencies of the sub-agencies of the United Nations are supposed to be acting independently and observing and adhering to international law, not catering to a specific government, and certainly not being an extension of any foreign ministry, and in this case of the State Department. The United States, of course, had been used to the United Nations and its sub-agencies being sort of an extension of the State Department during the presidency of Harry Truman from 45 to 52. That began to change with the challenge of not just communist Russia and communist China, that is the Soviet bloc and communist China, but also with the rise of the non-aligned group. Now we are at an age today where the United States which claims, by the way, to abide by the rule of law, and which selectively invokes international law and invokes human rights, okay, and agrees with the sub-agencies of the United Nations, including the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, when the rulings of those bodies apply to countries, to governments that the United States opposes, namely Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Sudan, North Korea. When it applies to countries that the United States opposes, then it has no problem abiding by those and by those rulings. And it also encourages the United Nations body and member governments. Remember, the U.S. did not ratify the Convention on Genocide. Let's be clear on that. But it encourages other members to abide by it when it pertains only to governments that the United States opposes, not to Israel. Now, let me be very clear that there are also United Nations articles pertaining to the role of companies around the world in so far as they violate international law with regard to their participation. Now, I realize this is a legalistic issue, but with regard to their participation in acts of war that go beyond what is agreed to as conventional warfare. Now, the war that Israel launched after October 2023 against the people of Gaza is not a conventional war. A conventional war right now, for example, is that between Russia and Ukraine. You have two rivals and their armies going at each other. So there is a presumed relationship of conventional armed forces going against other conventional armed forces. There is no conventional armed force in the case of the Palestinian people. It's just civilians. And it's mostly, the victims are mostly women and children. Most of the victims are women and children, whether they are fatalities, injured, displaced, and so forth. This is the case, and this is the ruling of United Nations sub-agencies, the United Nations Rapporteur, Special Rapporteur for Palestine. So this is the ruling. The US has refused to go along with this, just as it has decided not only not to abide by the ruling of the International Criminal Court, but to sanction the court. Now, the reason I set this up in this manner with regard to international law and what applies at the UN level is because if the United States government adopts this position, why would corporations, US corporations, or for that matter, any corporations, European included, any corporations, have any qualms about their complicity in Israel's genocide war? This is one angle, the legal angle, although, as I said, there are legal cases, mostly in the United Kingdom, by the way. Let me just be clear about that. Mostly in the United Kingdom. There are also some in the United States, but most are here in Europe, against companies' complicit role in the genocide that Israel has been carrying out against the people of Gaza. Now, the second issue I want to raise is the context of specific companies, whether it's Microsoft, Google, any or the major defense companies from Boeing to the rest, to Raytheon and so forth, selling whether it's planes or weapons or bombs or whatever they're selling, or IT surveillance systems. Amazon, by the way, I forgot to mention, is a big one in there. Whatever they're selling, the or whether it's banks financing the sale, or whether it's even fast food companies. There are some fast food companies involved. There are all sorts of Western companies part of, as an integral part of the war economy of Israel. And the question is, are they complicit in the genocide of Israel while it is unfolding? Also, a legal question, by the way. This is a question for international law as well. So that is another angle. Now, the way, as a historian of international political economy, the way I look at it is that Israel is well integrated into the world capitalist economy. It has enormous leverage, especially in the United States, through Wall Street, through companies in Silicon Valley, through defense contractors in the United States, but also in Europe. This does not mean that US corporations are the only ones involved, that have been involved since Israel started the genocide against the people of Palestine in that conflict. There are non-Western companies, there are European companies, there are non-Western companies, there are even a couple of Chinese companies involved. And China, of course, has made its position very clear, very loudly, especially at the UN Security Council level, along with Russia, that it is adamantly against this. But there have been some cases, a couple of companies that are involved. So companies from all over the world are in fact involved in this. And the most amazing thing about all of this is that Muslim countries have, for the most part, there are very few exceptions, for the most part, been conducting trade. Their companies are doing business with Israel, and in some cases, they actually doubled the trade relations. Some of these Muslim, Uzbekistan, for example, doubled its trade relations with Israel. Egypt's conducting business with Israel as though nothing has happened, but the government of Egypt comes out and castigates Netanyahu and the genocide in Gaza. Well, the fact is, the Gulf states, the same thing. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia has put officially some terms on the table about a two-state solution, but all along they have been carrying out trade. Indonesia is another one, not in the region, but Muslim country. They have been doing this. Okay, India, which has a large population of Muslims, has been collaborating. Indian companies, in other words. So this is a global issue because capitalism is an international system, and corporations around the world seeking profit see opportunities, especially in war, because in war there is enormous profit to be made, and they're going to go after the profit. No matter what the Geneva Convention says about genocide, doesn't matter. No matter what the ICC ruling and the ICJ rulings are, doesn't matter. US is providing the cover, so why should they care? Right? They even sanctioned the ICC and the prosecutor. So what we have here is complicity by corporations with the cover of the state, okay? And the most powerful of those states, with the largest, most powerful military in the world, is the United States. So it's not surprising that Silicon Valley and Wall Street companies are involved. Okay, not at all. Now, um, the question, of course, is twofold, and that's the theme I'm going to work around in this session. One, the legality of this and the violation of international law, and I started with all of this giving you some background. And then the second is the moral dimension of this, and where is the moral outcry, not necessarily by people at the grassroots level, because there have been mass demonstrations since this war started, by the way, to the credit of people in the Muslim world, in the Christian world, and even Jewish organizations, by the way, and to their credit, that have come out and said this is immoral, it should not be taking place. And they have castigated, they have criticized, severely criticized companies complicit in the genocide of Israel. Some of these companies, by the way, also complicit in the illegal settlements of Israel in the West Bank. So it's not just the genocide, which obviously is the worst of all this, but the settlements and ethnic cleansing financed by Western banks with involvement by Western real estate companies, investment groups putting money in there. Okay, so all of this is made possible in the context of a world capitalist system of which Israel is well integrated, and it has enough of influence in Western governments, especially in the United States, leading the charge here, okay, to pull this through. This is the reason, by the way, that we have not seen much progress. But I should tell you, by the way, as an aside, throughout history, the fact is that um, the private sector, businesses and technology specifically, that has applicability to defense has always been the case, from the Persian Empire to the Greeks to the Romans to throughout the modern European era, especially during the 17th century with the scientific revolution. Even Peter the Great, who was not exactly interested in science, but he was astute enough. Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, by the way, in the 17th century, he was astute enough to realize the applicability of science and technology in the defense sector. So his interest in science and technology was not necessarily to make life better for human beings, for the Russian serfs. On the contrary, it was to expand the Russian that is engaged in what is called in Russian history internal colonization, use the military to glorify Russia under his emperorship, under his regime. So it isn't new that this is not new that something that's happening with Israel, that companies are involved. Historically, this is the case, especially since the scientific revolution in the 17th century, and then in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution. Science and technology applied to industry strengthens Western militaries, especially in the 19th century, the US, of course, in the late 19th century, and Japan. So you get this effect of science and technology and industry and its applicability to the defense sector, both land forces as well as naval forces. Nothing new about that. Now, what we have in especially since the Truman administration, by the way, when the Cold War starts, is that the Cold War, the Truman, by the way, let me just as an aside, Truman is the president who gave the green light on the use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, this is the ultimate application of science and technology in the domain of the military, of the defense sector. Okay. And just coincidentally, Israel as a state, the Zionist state, is born during the Truman era, 1948. Right? So in the mid 40s, they were fighting Palestinians to push them aside so they can have their own state. And by 1948, they agreed and they established it. So Israel as a state emerges in the era of the atomic bomb. And they recognized, David Ben-Gurion, of course, of Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel, recognized the importance of applying science and technology and industry to the defense sector. And the difference is, and this is the reason that this is one of the reasons this is entitled the role of businesses, the role of corporations in the neoliberal era. In the era of David Ben-Gurion, the state had control of the defense industries. After the 1980s, what happens is that the state, undergoing neoliberal conversion, and this is true to this day, accommodates the private sector, allows the private sector to have hegemony and make money, both domestic and foreign private sector, and merges the war economy with the civilian economy. This is the catalyst. This is very important, by the way, because this is how Israel operates. And so it feeds the civilian economy by stimulating the war economy, okay? And it does so in large measure thanks to foreign aid, a lot of it from the United States, obviously taxpayers, given that historically Israel has been America's largest aid recipient, by the way. And the role of private companies has been to go in there, foreign and domestic, obviously, to go in there and realize large profits. Everyone from Intel to Microsoft to Amazon, Google, Boeing, Raytheon, all the McDonnell Douglas, they're all there selling something. Surveillance companies, Palantir, for example, Silicon Valley these days with IT. So you have this special relationship under the neoliberal model between the state and the private sector. And the private sector's, of course, role is to increase the value of their stock, right? A return on the investment for their investors. And the question, of course, again, I reiterate, is what is their legal and moral responsibility when it's not just selling them surveillance systems for recreation, right? But to target people to assassinate them. What if it is selling artificial intelligence for precision bombing civilians, women and children? Okay, so this is a larger issue about what is the legal and moral responsibility of the private sector when it comes. And Israel happens to be the case study that we're dealing with, but it could be any country. Now, were this the case, for example, let's take as an example Iran, the major rival of the United States and Israel, with Israel leading the charge, wanting the United States actually to hit Iran using the pretext of the Iran's development of a nuclear bomb, although Israel has nuclear weapons, by the way. Anyway, well, what if Iran, what if it were not Israel in this case, and it was Iran? And what if it were not the United States, it was China and Russia doing what US companies are doing in Israel? What would the United States reaction be? Moral outrage, demands for the World Court, for the ICC and the ICJ, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, for the United Nations to condemn this as genocide, war crimes, and everything. Throw everything throw the book at them. But this is the United States, which decides unilaterally that it doesn't apply to the United States and to Israel. Israel is exempt from this. American exceptionalism, the doctrine of American exceptionalism, going back to the 19th century, the doctrine of American exceptionalism permits the United States to, and its companies and Western companies, when it comes to helping Israel, to transcend the law, to transcend international law and moral standards and norms of war, and to engage in genocide. And the question here, and it's one that has been raised by a number of scholars, one of the most important studies of this was done in the 1970s and 1980s by the late Palestinian American scholar at Columbia University, Edward Said, in his work entitled Orientalism. Clearly, there is white supremacy assumptions here because these are Muslims and they're non-European. So they are the value ideologically in the white Western European world, although, as I said, Muslim countries, I don't want to leave this out, this is true, Muslim countries have been collaborating through commercial relations with Israel, and some of them doubled their trade relations with Israel, made a lot of money all along, all this time that Israel has been in the conflict in Gaza, in this genocide in Gaza. So I'm not excusing any of that. I want to be very clear. Even, like I said, even China, a couple of companies in China involved. Okay, not excusing India involved. Okay, fair is fair. They're involved. However, there is a mentality, an ideological prejudice, if you will, of Orientalism, as the late Edward Said argued, namely, everything is viewed from a Eurocentric, American-centered perspective, a white Anglo-Protestant perspective in favor of the Zionist state and against the Palestinians. Okay. Now, Israel tried to emulate the United States in several respects in its formative years. This is from David Ben-Gurion onwards, that is the early years to the present. One of the assumptions back then was that little Israel was surrounded, although it was the aggressor and it drove the Palestinians, it regimented the Palestinians to the lands that essentially kept taking after 67, 74, so 73 rather, the 73, the Yom Kippur War, the 67, 7 Days War. So although it had taken a lot of land from the Palestinians, and it continues to, and although its policy was one of ethnic cleansing, consistently a policy of Lebensraum, which, by the way, that's a German word which means living space, that is, acquires much of the space that, namely the Palestinian territory, as possible by getting rid of the Palestinians. That's the policy to this day, okay? And expand beyond Israel into Syria, into Lebanon, into Egypt, okay, into Jordan. So the idea of a greater Israel, by realizing this Lebensraum policy, comes about how? unless there is the the powerful economic entity behind the government to carry this out. No government in the world, from the ancient times to the present, has been able to do much in the domain of the military unless it has the economic muscle behind it. Governments that weakened economically, historically, collapsed, okay? And large empires collapsed, for that matter. So what we have here is a government that has found the key, if you will, to pursue the militarism and occupation, to perpetuate apartheid in the state of Israel, because about half of the population is Palestinian, impose apartheid on them, just like South Africa before Nelson Mandela, okay? And he has done this by pursuing, throughout the Cold War, a policy not so different from the one that the United States was pursuing throughout the Cold War, and it still is, that is military Keynesianism. Spend as much through deficit financing as much as possible. In the case of Israel, it's through a lot of aid as well for defense, but use the defense sector also to stimulate the economy and have that and have the civilian economy enjoy the derivative effects by spending in the defense sector. Now, at the same time, that is also a catalyst for keeping the people of Israel unified behind the greater Israel expansionist Lebensraum, as I call it, policies, trying to acquire as much land, getting rid of as many Palestinians as possible. And the amazing thing is that not so much that the West has gone along with it, especially the United States, but Western Europe as well, but that the Arab world has not shown much resistance, placing its economic to all of this, to apartheid, to ethnic cleansing, by the way, and now genocide, and now we have the situation where the leverage of the Muslim countries is very low vis-a-vis Israel and the United States, because their economic interests, well integrated into Western economies and Israelis, but also Western entities with a Zionist connection back to Israel. So they are sort of trapped. And so because they're going to place, every time they place their own interests, the financial interests, above the people of Palestine, by the way. If they had done otherwise, there would not be this genocide. It would have stopped right away. This would have stopped. But they don't place the lives of the Palestinian people above their financial interests. So again, I'm not isolating, I'm not targeting just one group of companies or another. It is, in fact, almost universal. There is very little opposition. Norman Finkelstein recently in a panel pointed out, he's a critic of Zionism. He pointed out, let's face it, about the only real opposition to what's going on here with the genocide, with regard to genocide, is coming from the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which, of course, the United States has historically been trying to get rid of, to eliminate. Trump's restarted this conflict again recently to pressure Iran indirectly, although the Houthis are linked, by the way, are linked to Iran. They operate by and large, to a very large degree, independently. But they are about the only ones on this planet that have taken an active role. Hezbollah also, but not to the degree that the Houthis have. Hezbollah, of course, has a different set of problems, considering the collapse of the Assad regime in December in Syria, and now a regime that's pro Gulf state Arab and pro Israel, pro West. Considering that, and considering that Syria is now a target by Israel for partition, the southern part, and then Turkey up in the north east, where there's a large concentration of Kurdish population. So corporations, by the way, corporations are hiding behind all of this. And the mass media is not calling out. It's not calling out the role of companies in the genocide of Israel. You're not going to see much in the mass media, because the mass media, the corporate media, is committed to representing corporate interests. And the companies themselves, okay, are hiding behind the government. They are, well, we just have a contract to sell surveillance systems, or we have a contract to sell parts for weapons. We have a contract for IT, whatever contract they have. Although the end result of that, no, by the way, means, or we sell, for example, Microsoft selling cloud space. Okay. And in one of the meetings, open meetings, there were a couple of employees of Microsoft who actually objected, saying, look, what we're doing here, what our company is doing, is it's involved in what's going on over there. We should not be in that business. We should not be making, just for the extra buck, have this on our conscience, have the lives of kids, of women and children in Gaza. Those two employees who spoke out were immediately fired. They were fired by the company. Okay, so this is the result. And the companies, of course, argue, look, don't look at me. I'm just a corporation. I'm looking after my investors' interest. Go to the government. It's government policy. So companies are hiding behind government, when in fact, and this is the interesting thing about neoliberalism, they are the ones driving government policy, because they want the extra profit. They want that money. There is no profit in the poor people of Palestine, in those children, those women, and adult males, of course, as well. There's no profit in them. There is profit in getting rid of them and doing what the Trump administration had proposed when it initially took office, and that is turn Gaza into the Riviera, the version of the French Riviera along the southeastern Mediterranean Sea. Make money from luxury hotels, luxury condominiums, shops and restaurants and so on. Make it the new Dubai. What about Palestinians? Oh, we don't want them. Maybe to clean the hotel rooms, but that's about it. No Palestinians. So the idea of Lebensraum, let me put it very crudely, but it applies, the idea of Western imperialism, 19th century style, because this is when the Zionist movement emerged in the 1890s, is very much alive right now. Okay. Now, just as an aside, by the way, since I mentioned 19th century imperialism, the really important role of companies and science and technology did not start with the Manhattan Project. I mentioned earlier the Manhattan Project and the state of Israel emerging as an entity, as a new state in the world community in 1948. Actually, it was World War I, when chemical warfare was used. And in the 1930s, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, used chemical warfare in Ethiopia. So it was really from World War I to the interwar period that there was an intense interest. And this is when, by the way, World War I is when the United States established the foundations of what Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. There is a military-industrial complex in Israel. There is an Israeli military-industrial complex. And it involves both domestic companies as well as their foreign investors who are there, foreign companies who are there to be as an integral part of this war economy intertwined with a civilian economy. And this is how Israel survives. As this is a way of life for Israel. Now, I want to point out that there is a legal matter here, and there is a matter of international law, and there is a matter of accountability. Now, those of you who follow the news know that Netanyahu recently visited Trump. Now, one of the very active independent journalists in the United States, Max Blumenthal, in his website posted an article arguing that he had, of course, information that that AIPAC, the Jewish lobby, the Israeli lobby in Washington, was very active in making sure that Netanyahu visits, is one of the first to visit. And according to Blumenthal, AIPAC, the Israeli lobby in Washington, bragged about molding ideologically and politically all the people that Trump hired in his national security team to come in and not to deviate from the Biden pro-Zionist position. Not that Trump would, by the way. Ukraine is a different situation, not the same as the no urgency to end the conflict, the genocide in Gaza, an urgency to end that war in Ukraine, but not in the Middle East. Destabilizing the Middle East, and the Trump administration has proved it, is beyond party lines, by the way. I want to make sure that people understand I'm not blaming the Trump administration for anything, because the Democrats, as Biden proved, were the ones who were in office while the genocide in Gaza started. And it was Biden who went to Tel Aviv and embraced Netanyahu. Instead of sitting down and trying to solve this crisis through diplomatic channels and not have over 50,000 civilians so far in Gaza dead, mostly women and children, and over 100,000 injured, and a couple of million displaced. And this thing is continuing because Israel violated the ceasefire agreement, by the way, while the Trump administration has been hitting Yemen, apparently to weaken the Houthi rebels, who, as Norman Finkelstein pointed out, they're the only ones really who have stood up in favor of the people of Palestine. The rest of the world has not. The rest of the world, it doesn't matter that they talk a good game. They have not. And there is a responsibility here. And the responsibility is not just at the political level. What about the investors in the companies that facilitate, that are complicit, according to independent press reports that we have. Even the Guardian, by the way, Manchester Guardian in England, has published a couple of stories on this, and they're not exactly, they're progressive, but they're not exactly, um, you know, a kind of paper that is way out there and to the left. They have published stories about this. So what is the role of the investors? They're saying, well, I have investments in Google. I'm making money. If they can make money out of the Gaza situation, well, it's not my fault. I'm just an investor. So there is no outcry here. Even more important, where are the Western identity groups from feminists? Because women and children, by the way, have been killed since this war started in Gaza. Women and children, they are the ones who have been injured, killed, displaced, a humanitarian crisis. Where are the Western identity groups complaining about these companies, saying, look, what are you doing? You're facilitating a tragedy. This is not, you, go ahead, make money. Not like this, not on the blood of the Palestinian people, but they're not out there. Another group, namely the role of religious organizations. It's true that the Pope Francis in Rome, has spoken out on occasion. Obviously, he's aging, he has health problems. I recognize all of that. But by and large, when you look at the totality of religious organizations, you're not going to see very much. And this is an ethical question. This is a moral issue. Do we draw the line somewhere on mass killings, perhaps on women and children? Or do we just let that go? Because they happen to be Muslim and Arabs. Because the Western reaction to white Christian children in Ukraine is not the same. And there have not been, by the way, Russia, as evil as anyone wants to describe it, has not carried out a deliberate campaign of targeting women and children in Ukraine. The US had no problem castigating Vladimir Putin during the Biden administration as a war criminal. But when you look at the statistics of the deaths of women and children in Gaza versus Ukraine, and when you look at the role of Western corporations in Israel facilitating what has been happening, you have to wonder about the double standard, the hypocrisy of the West. And you have to wonder about institutional reaction. Like I said, where are the identity groups? All these progressive groups, liberal to the democratic side, in support of the people of Gaza. So that is an important issue that has to do with the value system. It has to do with ideology. It has to do with a Western-centered perspective of the world. So the Western value system and the perspective is, well, as long as it's not us or people like us. If it's global South, okay, we overlook at it. We allow companies to make a buck on that. Now, I want to end with an issue that was very similar in some respects, and that is the role of corporations and making money from apartheid in South Africa. Those of you who have studied the history of South Africa, you know that obviously apartheid was a way of life there, and there were calls for during the Eisenhower administration, there were calls for boycott and divestment in sections down there by Westerners saying, look, this is, you got 80% of the population that's native population, the Africans, and then you have a handful of whites who control everything, including the destiny of the native population that they conquered, their ancestors conquered. And they're exploiting their labor. Okay? The Afrikaners are exploiting their labor and the natural resources of the land. It starts there and it really takes off in the 1980s because in the 1970s, the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter, to his credit, by the way, in some respects, launches the Human Rights Initiative as an integral part of US foreign policy. However, he wasn't that keen on looking at the South African situation specifically and the situation in Israel, namely the plight of the Palestinian people. Later, he would change his mind after he was out of office, by the way. To his credit, Jimmy Carter, and I've said this in a video session before, just dedicated to him, to his memory, was a moral man. But the policy of the United States, when he launched a human rights component as an integral part of US foreign policy, okay, the two countries, apartheid countries, Israel and South Africa, were not there. In the 1980s, however, there was enormous pressure ironically, during the Reagan era. That's when the neoliberal political economy was institutionalized against companies doing business in South Africa. And this began to build up very rapidly. Now, it's true that there is an identity issue. The US is about 13.5%, 14% of the population that's Black. So there was the issue of identifying with of Black Americans, Black leaders identifying with the native population, the Blacks, the South African native population, the Blacks in South Africa, and demanding freeing Nelson Mandela, right? That decade, there was no such movement against Israel, although Israel was an apartheid state that decade, obviously, as it is today. Okay? Okay, notice this is a very important issue. Companies, one by one, began to have pressure. This is why I mentioned the stuff before about institutional pressure on companies to divest. They felt pressure about South Africa. Nothing about it, nothing about Israel. Silence about Israel. Because of the enormous interest of Wall Street and the Jewish lobby, the Israeli lobby, and pro-Zionist elements that were not Jews, by the way, and but their interests converged ideologically, politically, and economically with those of the Zionist state. So they left out Israel. In South Africa, the boycott, sanctions, divestment, so-called BDS for Palestinians today, that worked. Nelson Mandela was out, transition period, and so forth. Nothing like that in Israel. So today, what we have is a movement, but it's very weak because there isn't much support. And that support must first come from the Muslim world. When you see that they have been profits, some of those countries have been companies within those countries, Muslim countries. I mentioned Uzbekistan and Indonesia, but there are other countries. Albania, for example, has really skyrocketed. Its trade skyrocketed with Israel. All this time that it's been carrying out genocide against the people of Gaza, some of the countries with a lot of Muslim, a great deal of population that's Muslim, India included, by the way, have actually increased commercial relations with Israel, like rewarding them. Go ahead, do more. We're making money. So this is a problem, but it has to start with locally at the regional level. When there is greater value being placed on rewarding the United States with trillions from Gulf state. They have promised, by the way, during the Trump period, as soon as Trump came in, the United Arab Emirates, um, Saudi Arabia, and a few others promised to invest in the next 10 years, not billions, but trillions in the US economy. That's a reward. Why should the US not pursue what it's doing? Hit the Houthis who are supporting the Palestinians, the Houthi rebels down in Yemen. Okay, so this is important. When you have Muslim investment, Arab investment in US companies, many of them, by the way, pro Israeli, pro Zionist, and with investments in Israel. Everybody has investments in Google, Microsoft, and Meta, and so forth, and Amazon, right? They do too, by the way. Arabs have investments in those companies that do business with Israel, facilitating this genocide. So why would the rest of the world blink on this? This is, again, a very serious issue. And we come, and this is, I want to conclude this because we're up on the hour. We come to the issue of leverage. Just as the Kurdish population up in northern Syria and in Iraq doesn't have much leverage, so it can have the state of Kurdistan and have autonomy and so forth. The Palestinians don't have much leverage, and the reason is very simple. Their supposedly Arab brothers, Muslim brothers, place greater value on money, how much money they can make, no matter the rhetoric, by the way. Don't follow the rhetoric. The rhetoric is meaningless. Everybody's judged by their actions and by results, not what they say. They can say anything they want. So far in this war, we have seen the results, and trade statistics and the role of companies in Israel, foreign companies, speak for themselves. It doesn't matter what they say. This is a very, very important issue. I want to make one other comment, and then I guess I'll close it at that. During the Nuremberg trials, the issue of German companies, and by the way, having said that, you can Google German companies that supported the Third Reich and were directly or indirectly involved in the Holocaust. You can Google that. You can also Google companies, the American Friends Service Committee, the American Friends and Service Committee has also a list. That's the most comprehensive list. But you can Google companies involved in Israel and facilitating both the illegal settlements and the attack of Israeli genocide conflict war against the Palestinian people. You can Google all that. Now, Nazi Germany was successful in carrying out the war, and specifically the Holocaust genocide, because companies, domestic and even foreign, facilitated it. And you can look at that too and see how that happened. And some of those companies, major names, I'm not going to start mentioning German companies, paid reparations to Israel later. Now we have Israeli companies and foreign companies engaged in what the International Criminal Court has clearly ruled is genocide. The US government reaction is punish the court, for making such a ruling. Okay? When they make it against Israel, I guess we'll ignore it and punish the court. When they make it against North Korea or Vladimir Putin or Moscow or whatever other country, Venezuela, Cuba, the Sudan, it doesn't matter who, then we'll urge them to keep going, but not against us and not against our ally Israel. So the hypocrisy here is an issue. Western hypocrisy, again, I invoke the memory of the great Palestinian American scholar Edward Said, um, who in his work Orientalism stated that indeed this is a question of hypocrisy and of white supremacist rooted ideology. I thank you for listening. I ask that you raise questions, write comments, and above all, that you join this channel. This is an educational channel. The approach here is analytical, nonpartisan. Thank you very much.